Hello everybody, I'm here to have some scattered thoughts on Hades because I've been playing it a lot and I think it's pretty good. Anyway, starting off with the progression system with the House of Hades, the way it completely goes in several different plot lines at their own pace depending on who you talk to and when, and how it keeps growing and moving on is actually a very good way to organize a story-driven roguelike like this. There's also, of course, all the ways that things evolve over time, like your upgrades and such that you carry from run to run, but that doesn't really jeopardize the roguelike aspects of each run. There are some problems with that as I'm going to talk about later, but overall, as a premise, it's a really good way to do progression. And of course, that's all enhanced by the great music, visualization, the upgrades, the art design. It is all impeccable, from voice acting to its general look. The game looks great, and that helps me be invested in the story, the characters, the world building. It helps me talk about it. But there's, once again, there's some problems with that. The game looks too good for its own good. Anyway, the upgrade system is fine. It incentivizes you to play with multiple weapons, which is great. And the darkness system is just, it's pretty perfect. It balances around many different play styles, many different aspects of weapons are generally built around them as well, which ends up making them feel very meaningful choices. There's also, of course, the pact of punishment disabling them, making them much more important, because now when you have them, you really feel it. On the aspects of weapons, they're all great, even though some of them suck ass. But to me, the worst thing about this game, the reason I really wanted to make this video, is the keepsakes. They kind of suck. Like, they're garbage, I'm sorry. Because they exist in one to two ways. The ways where they completely warp the way you play the game to where they don't really affect the way you play the game moment to moment, but they do a little change. But the ones that produce little changes are all the ones that make sure the gods show up. And the gods are so good. They're cool, they have meaningful interaction with you, they're a big part of the storyline, their bounces are unique, they play off each other, they banter. The trial of the gods, where you have to choose one of the other gods, are very compelling. You have to weigh like which interactions you want to see, which punishment is worse to fight against. It's all really good. So the idea that you're ever going to pick a trinket that isn't a trinket that changes which boom of each god is going to be the first one you get is complete bullshit, because you're always picking it because the gods are so good and so cool and so unique. Therefore, for a trinket that isn't involved with the gods to be good or cool or a meaningful choice at all, it has to completely warp the way you play the game. And some of them do that, like the one from Thanatos, because they completely warp, again, the way you play the game. They make play the game a completely different way, completely different experience. But there are a lot of them, like Duzas, that are just in that horrible middle ground where they don't completely affect the way you play the game completely, but they still take away, the control over which gods you meet. And that makes them completely worthless in my eyes. A complete failure of game design. Like, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to balance the trinkets around the fact that the gods are really cool. And for me to pick a trinket that doesn't involve them, they have to, again, complete change the nature of the game or the way you're playing it. Because if they don't do that, I will just never pick a trinket that isn't god related until the very last stage at Stinks. Sometimes not even that. But regardless, the way this game is structured into three pieces is perfectly brilliant. Each one of them has their own distinctive style. Even if they had to fudge some lore to get there, it was clearly worth it. Asphodel being flooded by lava gives it a completely different stylistic choice than the green of Tartarus, because generally you would put, lighter colors towards the middle and have the lowest level of the underworld be completely black, but they decided to just simply surpass that by picking a big color, green and then red and then bluish for Elysium. And that's honestly was a great design decision. The path of punishment also is just perfectly designed, you know. There are many levels to basically every single condition. They're all unique and you can feel them in every room that you play the game in. They affect not only the way you think, but the way you build your character, from your mirror upgrades to the way you pick booms. They're all just completely perfect. I have no problem with that. Aside from, once again, the way they interact with the keepsakes. Like, even if you pick the most horrible conditions for the pact of punishment, that doesn't stop the keepsakes from feeling samey. And that's, really the big problem here. But that's not really a game destroying problem, because as it turns out, one mechanic falling kind of flat sometimes doesn't destroy the tapestry that has been built. This is not a immersion sim where if even one mechanic is kind of trash, everything falls apart. No. If one mechanic is kind of okay, you just ignore it. And that's how it manifests in the aspects, because a lot of the aspects of weapons suck ass, but that's fine. Like, the fact that I gravitate towards the archer sword as the only aspect of Stygius that I'll ever use is fine, because they all, reward certain styles of play, and some of the styles of play they reward are something that I would never do, and that's fine. Variety, that's exactly what we need for games like this to keep them fresh, because I have 40 hours in this game and I'm nowhere near done. I'm don't even have every keepsake. There are still the little companions that I have to get, but I have to max out my relationship with characters to do that, and I don't really care that much about all of them. Megra is fun to shit talk to, but I'm not invested in maxing out her thing. I'm going to max out Hades because it's base, and that's, once again, coming back to the problem with keepsakes, which I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's honestly the only part of the game that's bad. Like, legit misstep. But still, let's not dwell on that too much and talk about more about the way the mirror upgrades interact with each other, because they interact with the items of the Well of Charon, for example. They are very roguelike in their inclusion, and I love them. But the way the Charon's item makes them have a very extended duration means that you could conceivably warp your entire build around it, make an entire build around Deep Pockets or Golden Touch to get enough coins so that you can completely and consistently use Well of Charon items to strengthen yourself. That's a valid way to play, and that is strong enough that it completely warps away from, you needing to see the gods because they're base. But once again, not every keepsake was created equally. Sisyphus, for example, is to me the worst offender. He doesn't do anything. Oh, 100% damage on attack and special attack when they're not empowered by a boon, but most boons empower your attacks by at least 70% alongside a different effect. Weak from Aphrodite, fucking knocking enemies away from Poseidon, etc., so on. So the idea that you ever would use Sisyphus for anything is just kind of absurd. I also like how some gods like Hermes are completely benign and just focus on completely different attributes than the other gods. And his keepsake reflects that. Once again, being a drastic change in the way you play, therefore forcing you to play the game a completely different way, playing quickly so that you get bonuses. It's all very well thought out for the most part. So even if there are a few duds. Extreme Measures is easily a very compelling pact of punishment that makes the game significantly harder. In a very simple way, it makes the bosses more complicated. But it's compelling because it fuses parts of bosses that already existed. The Three Sisters is a perfect example of that, because instead of fighting one, you fight one manly, and then have that has the support of the other two. And that's just a compelling way to make the game more difficult without turning the enemies into bullet sponges, for example. Though one of the pack of punishment conditions is to turn enemies into bullet sponges by increasing their HP by like 100%, which, you know, is very uncompelling in my opinion. But once again, it's optional. That option is really what makes it, you know, meaningful, because there's never a pact of punishment condition that is inflicted upon you without your desire. I'm playing a basic run where the only thing I'm doing really is extreme measures to like show that off. But either way, what I think is most compelling about any of this, regardless, is the non-combative booms. Because, you know, even though I shit on the keepsake system, the idea is from something like Sisyphus trinket that strengthens the way your attack goes, is that you, even if you pick boons from gods, you can pick boons that are not based on attack or special, keeping the bones uh, from Sisyphus trinket without, you know, completely taking away your building power. And that's fine, but that completely warps your build about around your mirror as well. And the synergy that you get for all that compromising with him is a meager bonus. It needed to be like, I don't know, 250% for it to be worth it. Because the moment you get a boon that affects it, it's over. And if you're not getting boons that affect it, it's not strong enough to compete, you know. And yeah, but either way, we're now in Asphodel, which is a great environment for not only storytelling, as you have Eurydice's plotline with Orpheus here being a revamped version in a lot of ways. It's also, you know, in general, just a completely different beast in terms of the enemy variety for Tartarus. This game is basically only has 4 stages and a final boss being Hades himself, and they somehow managed to get, you know, despite recurring enemies like the witches, they managed to get a good variety of enemies in every stage. And to me, that's another, you know, win for the game design, because the spreaders are from Elysium, but there are some other types of witches whose name I forgot, that are familiar to here and only show up here, and the way they clamber up is completely unique. Of course, there are enemies with super armor. Super armor is a very basic concept, and it's somehow not overused, even if there are multiple pact of punishment conditions based around that, some of which give all enemies super armor, and some of which make enemies with super armor have, you know, extra attacks, extra conditions, extra perks that makes them more powerful. Some others, for example, like the one we're very soon going to get into this run, is to make mini bosses a huge hassle, which is great, you know. Once again, the trial of the gods that we're undergoing right now is a completely in character, meaningful interaction with the gods, which once again reinforces the thing that the gods are cool, they're good, they're well designed, they have great personalities, they affect gameplay in meaningful ways, they completely warp the game because they're so good. So the idea of not using the boons of the gods and focusing on a build that's around like Daedalus hammers and not getting offensive boons, that's just, I'm sorry, but that's just very uncompelling as a video game idea. I'm glad the option exists, but I find it very difficult to believe anybody would pick it, you know? Anyway, the trial of the gods is defined by the fact that the god that you don't choose in the trial attacks you. And each one of them has their own method of attack. Dimitri makes snowstorms, Zeus makes thunderbolts, Dionysus makes pools of poison. And yeah, that's all good. The hangover effect alongside weak is a very basic combination, because if you're applying both of them at the same time, you also get, you know, your 40% damage bonus from my traits of the talent mirror, which is once again something that very much warps your building of your character. Though there are pact of punishment conditions again that affect it. And once again, pact of punishment, perfectly designed. God's boons, perfectly designed. There's just the right mix of offensive and unoffensive boons to make it worth it to experiment and test it out, etc. and so forth. Now, the keepsakes are kind of weak because the idea that you wouldn't pick a keepsake that allows you to control, at least to an extent, the type of gods and which boons of each gods you get. It's just absurd, you know. You would never do that. It's just not worth it. Either way, this mini boss is very easy once you get the hang of it, but I already tested this out with the middle management condition of the pact of punishment that makes him harder. It makes him harder in a very compelling way. I thought they would just throw another stone guy at you so that it's even harder, but no, it's a very compelling way to make more difficult. He makes a huge wave and the Gorgona starts teleporting all over the place. Big fiction. Either way, the original songs for this are all perfect, all peak. There's nothing really to complain about. The Eurydice Orpheus plotline is compelling. Eurydice has good bonuses, so it's always good to come here. It also would be kind of a problem, right? Like Sisyphus is okay, but Eurydice and then Patrilicus up in Elysium are so good. They warp your run. You're always going to go into them every time they appear. And that does in a little bit, you know, take away from the choices of the run if it wasn't for the fact that the gods are also full-fledged characters with deep backstories and connections, just like Eurydice and Patrilicus, which means that unless you have a boon on the other side, you're always picking Eurydice and Patrilicus, which is kind of a problem, but it would also be a problem with the gods. So I'm not really, you know, mad about that. At the stage that I am right now on this quest, Persephone just came back and I'm still running around, you know, trying to find a way to fix all the mistakes of the past, make Eurydice and Orpheus come together, make Achilles and Patrilicus come together, you know, mend the rift between the gods of the Chthonic origin of hell and the Olympian gods up above, etc., so on. It's all very compelling because the way you do it is via gameplay. And there's also a very strong tactile sense of power. The same thing happens with like Hades. Hades, the boss, not the game, feels strong because it's hard, and you completely feel that in your skin because you're playing as the guy that has to fight him. So when you lose to him, it doesn't feel like a cutscene just played and that you're now, you know, weak. It feels meaningful because it is meaningful because you're the one fighting. It's a completely different beast from, let's say, a story-driven action RPG, you know, your Final Fantasy VII Remake. But it's still very compelling. I never expected a roguelike to be such a story-driven game, but still, we're technically in the post-game. After all, I already got my credits, I already got the big picture. The big thing about the game I already got, but I'm still going because there's a lot of side content to do, a lot of challenges to try, a lot of builds to try out. The conceit of the game is compelling, etc. You know, so despite the fact that it's been 40 hours of me playing this, the story hasn't run out, and it hasn't felt, you know, artificially stretched out either. It has been such a treat to play. It has made me realize how far you can take this structure. I now believe that a roguelike can be used to tell a compelling story, like a very compelling story, something that I didn't believe before, you know. And yeah, I expanded my horizons in terms of storytelling in video games to this game. And that may sound like a weird thing to say. I mean, you already had Binding of Isaac before this, but even so, Binding of Isaac didn't have a compelling side cast of characters, even if it had an interesting world to understand and explore, at least in my opinion. But that's on me. Anyway, we're just finishing up the Extreme Measures Hydra fight. To me, this is easily the worst extreme measures boss fight, it makes the fight more complicated in a very basic way. And the final stage where the Hydra becomes unleashed doesn't really show its stuff. She's not nearly active enough to warrant the extreme measures. The Hydra, the Three Furies fight is much harder than the Hydra fight in every conceivable sense. It's more chaotic, more unpredictable, more random, and yeah, maybe they just didn't have that much of a compelling idea for it, and that's fine. Not every idea has to be a banger. Not every fight has to be the most hard fight of all time. But considering how good the extreme measures for every other boss is, I'm a little bit disappointed on, you know, Asphodel's boss extreme measures idea. But either way, Charon's Oboe is such a great mechanic to structure around the shop. You know, it doesn't take away at all from the talent tree and the way things carry over from run to run, but it introduces a measure of risk taking in the context of the same run that completely, you know, warps to a certain extent the way you think about rewards. I find it very hard to believe anybody would, you know, unless you're using a Horde and Stash build, anybody would give up a God Boom for a Charon's Oboe. But it is very much a powerful, powerful reward that has meaningful consequences. So, and I'm surprised that the currency that you lose every time you die ends up being, you know, such a compelling decision-making point. Because I didn't expect that to be the case either. Basically, if I had to resume this video in one main point, is the fact that I very, very much didn't expect Hades to be this compelling, both in the narrative sense, with a compelling cast of characters and gods and stories that take from mythology without being bound by it, you know, but also from the way that it's a compelling game, you know. Once again, I hear Daedalus Hammer versus a God Boom. Daedalus Hammer is... I love it because they completely alter the way your weapon plays depending on which boon you get. But I also hate it because Daedalus isn't a character in the game, and that takes away, man. I'm sorry. I'm going to keep hitting on this point because it's true. Daedalus hammers are not that picked by me because, well, between hearing a line from Zeus or potentially getting an interaction between Zeus and Poseidon and Persephone and fucking Hades later once he hears the aid that I got from Zeus and all the ways that can play out, Daedalus does not have any cool lines, and that matters because not every Daedalus hammer upgrade is a banger, you know, is a god-altering super power. Some of them are kind of okay. Some of them are only stat-based, even if they warp, you know, the way you think and build your character moving forward, like Horde and Slash, because it makes you hoard money. But even so, you know, there is only so much, and the fact that Daedalus is not a character should have given the developers more leeway to make the Daedalus hammer upgrades more insane more often. Because if they are equivalent to a god boom in all but name, well, then everyone is going to pick a god boom because god booms are much more interesting because they have gods attached to them and interactions and all the mechanics of the rarity, the different types, the different ways they apply their unique stats. So Daedalus hammers are in an upward battle, and in my opinion, they need to be a little more insane to be perfect. But they're still great. There are times where I will pick a Daedalus hammer instead of a God Boom. Like right now, I already have Jolted, I already have my aid from Zeus, and I don't really care about the Zeus non-combat stance. So at this point, I pick the Daedalus hammer, despite the fact that Daedalus hammer doesn't have any cool lines or a cool icon, you know? And yes, I am, you know, basing my decisions based on how cool it is. But yes, this is a video game. The tactile feeling of coolness, of power, is as important, if not more important, than the actual numerical value of the power itself. There are many times where I picked a weaker upgrade that felt stronger. And that's going to keep being a thing that you have to design around as developers. You know, there's only so much you can do, of course. You can't control the minds of your players. Sometimes a player will feel bad about a mechanic that's perfectly balanced, and sometimes is skewed in their favor. But you, as a game developer, have to account for that, you know. Dash Noah, for example. It is pretty good, but it feels like shit. So I simply never get it anymore. I got it one time and I'm never getting it anymore. Why? Because it completely destroys one of the foundations of me enjoying this combat system. That is the free control of movement. I always get greater reflex, for example, instead of ruthless reflex. Because having an extra dash is heaven and earth for me. The extra damage, the huge amount of extra damage that you get once you get good with it, to me doesn't matter. The extra movement feels much more powerful than damage, even though that's objectively not true. If you're really good at the game, you're going to want the more damage to kill things faster so that you get more times to allow you to play with more mechanics. Like, for example, the Herm's Keepsake, that once again gives you bonuses if you complete stages quickly. Which is, once again, another victory of this design, because it has all these different mechanics and they don't feel differing at all. They all fit into each other in a meaningful way, and I love that for it. It's completely meaningful in that way. And once again, the fruits that give a level to your blooms, they're by far the most boring, because once again, they aren't cool, they're just number crunching. And number crunching is okay. Getting a random one every time you get a nectar is probably their best implementation so far in my gameplay, because you want nectar, because you want to talk to Persephone and Hades and fucking Megra, because they're cool characters. Here's the deal. Another point that I'm kind of getting to, but I'm not explaining very well, is that the cast of Hades is good and you want to interact with it. And therefore, gameplay concessions that you have to make to interact with it are more willing, you are more willing to make those concessions. Like, if you had to pick a weaker power, but it allow you to get more lines with a character, you would do that, because the characters are that good. And that also warps the way you do certain runs, because this game is accessible. There's multiple, you can modulate the difficulty, you can turn on God mode, you can turn on the pact of punishment, you can turn it off. You don't have to get good if you don't want to. But, you know, there's a huge array of different challenges for the player. And that, to me, is really meaningful, really compelling also, that it goes this far. The extreme measures of the Elysian fighters are just perfect. The Theseus chariot dismantles once he goes into phase 2. And I think that's great, because phase 2 Theseus can also get pretty dicey. Having to fight him in that chariot would be a little too complicated. But the Asterius, the bull, he keeps the armor all the way through, because really it only gets him more HP and one extra move. So it's not really that different from normal Asterius, but the way it interacts with the chariot version of Theseus makes this fight much more complicated, just on a mechanical sense. And once again, it is all very compelling. And once again, I'm showing why I prefer greater reflex and extra dashes. Just having control over who and when you are in the map is just meaningful to me. But regardless, this fight generally without the extreme measures is pretty basic. You dodge the spear coming from Theseus, and then you attack Asterius every time he comes over from an attack. But now, thanks to the extreme measures, he has these shockwaves once he lands, which means that you have to you have to be way more cautious when you're talking about it. And even more than that, you have to keep in mind all the ways that will interact with Theseus, who's running around in a chariot, throwing bombs all over the place, compromising a lot more space than he did back when he was dismounted before the extreme measures were implemented. This is actually just a perfect way to evolve this fight without compromising either of the core ideas, that there are two fighters and that you can take them all in any order that you want. You know, you could, if you want to, go into phase 2 of both of them at the same time, though that will be a much harder fight to manage in general. And yeah, as you can see, once the Minotaur has been taken care of, Theseus kind of becomes a non-factor while he's on his mount, because he was very clearly made to be support to the Minotaur, because the developers know that it's much easier to kill the Minotaur first than to kill Theseus. So they build around that. And that's smart, you know, instead of making Asterius much harder, they make Theseus a much more effective support for Asterius, which in turn make him much more of a good adversary. This fight was simply greatly improved by extreme measures without compromising neither of its most compelling ideas. It's a perfect way of explaining difficulty without number crunching. Perfectly designed. Once again, bringing back that I didn't think the Asphodel fight was that good, because right before it and right after it, you get these absolutely amazing fights. Anyway, in terms of keepsakes that you go to instincts, Lucky Tooth is the easy one because it's an extra revive that you can use on the last fight. There's also the one from Patrolicus that's also, you know, gives you extra resistances on the last fight of each stage. That's meaningful for sure. But beyond that, you know, there is extremely debate over whether or not you should bring boons that affect the last fight with Hades, or boons that help you find the Satyr Sack quickly. You know, boons that make your search for Satyr Sack more compelling. There is a problem here, you know. This is a game of chance ultimately. One wants to get here to Stinks. You have to bet that the ones that you're going in have the Satyr Sack, or you have to bet that they don't. Generally, the ones that have, you know, skulls that have the harder enemies also don't have the Satyr Sack, you know, since the Satyr Sack doesn't have a final encounter. It's just a Satyr Sack and then you go to Hades. But there is a boss fight here. It's a small rat, and you can just randomly run into it, or you can you can run to it on purpose also. It's very compelling in my opinion, because despite the random factor and that it may feel like it's taking away agency from the player, ultimately how much you explore past that point is on you, and you can mildly predict where it is, because the ones who have skulls on it generally won't have the Satyr Sack, because the hardest encounters, the boss encounters, are not the encounters of the Satyr Sack. The Satyr Sack is one of the easier encounters. So therefore, by never going to the ones with the skulls, you're kind of eliminating your chances of running into the rats. Of course, that's not a foolproof solution, but that allows you to manipulate the odds in your favor in a way that it feels like you still have meaningful agency in the situation, despite the fact that you're ultimately leading it up to chance. It's a fun compromise between complete random encounters and, you know, you clearly choosing where you want to go. It replicates the roguelike setting of the rest of the game in this limited environment in a way that's compelling. And I was surprised when I discovered that, because the first time I got here, I thought that it would kind of suck. But as it turned out, that was not the case at all. I was surprised by how compelling it felt. And sometimes I just go through all of the Satyr rooms before going into Hades, instead of simply going as soon as I get the Satyr Sack. Though in this run, I will for sure go as soon as I get it, because I have Strong Drink, a boon from Dionysus, that completely warps the way you think about the game. Because now you're thinking the game in terms of checkpoints, since Strong Drink completely warps the way you think about the healing fountains. They make them full revives, make them do more damage, which means that you are incentivized to get what his keepsake so you can get it early so that you can get it and get as many bonuses from it as possible, etc., so on and so forth. Once again, reinforcing how cool and good and well designed the gods are, and how completely worthless every keepsake that isn't completely out there and absurd is. Because if you're not helping me find the gods and you're not completely warping your gameplay around it, then you're garbage. Then you're garbage. And there's a lot of keepsakes in that garbage scale, like Deuces and Sisyphus. And I think that's kind of sad. Either way, the last shop here from Charon having multiple different things. You can even buy Titan blood here, which is great. It makes a golden touch, one of the mirror talents that was generally worthless aside from hoarding slash builds, completely valid as a way to stack up money so that you can get here and buy Titan blood. It's, once again, it's perfect. The subversion of the Cerberus boss fight not existing and then getting subverted again in the Extreme Measures Hades fight is just, once again, perfectly designed. Because you expect the Hades mini boss here, but it isn't. And the way in the talks you have with Hades before your fights, they give meaningful characterization to him and you and your weapons and your aspects. It's all so good and well conceived. Setting the game in winter was also a great choice because it allowed Dimitri to give slowing powers, but even so, I still wish for a DLC that changes up the seasons, because even if it would compromise a lot of the visual design of this fight, it's clear, it's white, it's all white and black, and your opponent is red. You know, it's all very readable, even at a distance, at a glance. And that's all intentional. And it's all these design decisions that are playing into each other to make a compelling experience. And as much as I am shitting on the keepsakes right now in this video, I need to impart upon you that they're all full of meaningful design choices that all worked out. I'm talking about one minor design choice that didn't pay off, in my opinion, as opposed to everything else. Extreme Measures Hades, instead of summoning normal mobs with super armor, he's summoning mini bosses, which is once again a perfect continuation without sacrificing difficulty or making it really that much more difficult. It's just a perfect continuation of what already existed before, and that's the victory of Extreme Measures as a pact of punishment condition in general. That they completely succeed at what they attempt to do, and that is make the boss fights significantly harder. And they do that without, you know, doing the basic things. Bullet sponge enemies, more enemies, etc. so forth. Super armor on everybody, etc. so on. Anyway, the fight with Hades is extremely meaningful, especially on Extreme Measures, because he now uses some of the moves that you could use as well, with the aspect of Hades of the Varata, the Eternal Spear. And all of that is just perfect. All that's just perfect. Anyway, I'm getting my ass kicked out of here. You know, I'm going to spoiler for you a little bit, but I don't really think I'm going to make it this run anyway. But that's just to show that I'm still learning. I'm trying to beat Hades at his full power before I do anything else, because he is a good teacher, even if you know, he subverts your expectations in good and bad ways. But regardless of all of that, if I go here with middle management, I think this fight would be easily the hardest fight in the game, and that would be without any number crunching at all, just by making the mini bosses have extra perks. And I think that's incredible. The way difficulty is designed in this game has been amazing, successful, and I mean, everyone already knows this game is well liked, it's well received, it's popular. You don't need me to tell you that the game is good, but I still gotta say it anyway. I'm surprised that all these design decisions, some of which seem to be in contradiction, all ended up working together in the end. This may not be a immersive sim where every single program has to play into every other system, otherwise it's all going to fall apart. But all the design decisions that were made and that do play into each other, they are meaningful enough that I'm surprised it went this well. Of course, this game was not made in a day, and there are a lot of adjustments to make it good, but God. And as I get slowly blown the fuck out here by Phase 2 Hades, I have to impart upon all of you that the most surprising thing about Hades is, once again to me, is its part as a story. Like the compelling tactile narrative of having to fight the god of hell, and the way that passes into gameplay, and the way that gameplay is uh, drawn in a meaningful way. That and all of that plays into the ideas of the story, the themes of family, by having all the Olympians feature here. I mean, not all of them. Helios, for example, didn't make the cut, sadly. Oh, and Cerberus not having a fight was at the same time a perfect subversion, but also an extremely unwelcome, diversion from what you were expecting. But having him come in here is just perfect. Just perfect in general. Wow, just wow. Anyway, what else is there to say, I think the keepsakes kind of suck sometimes, but aside from that, this game is very much perfectly designed. It's roguelike heaven, and it's using the roguelike genre to tell a story without compromising its progression. It's just very, very good. There's not a lot else for me to say as I slowly die to Hades Phase 2. I barely get to Phase 3, by the way. And yeah, that is the big twist, that he recovers HP in Phase 2, that he summons mini bosses in Phase 3, that he has the help of servers in Phase 2, and that he has a Phase 3 that is Phase 2 but harder, and you have limited vision. And yeah, that's just very compelling, And it really shows that before he was, letting you go after you make him kneel for truth. And yeah, I'm not used to the limited vision. I'm not used to the limited design space. I don't even know all the moves of Phase 3 Hades. And yeah, it's a whole new frontier, and it really feels like it. And to me, that's very meaningful. That's very meaningful. Even if he probably doesn't have that many unique moves anymore, because why would he? Still, the little things all add up into an overall brilliant experience that I am so happy that I'm not done with just by completing the main quest of the game. Either way, Hades is a huge triumph, and I am kind of addicted, and that's why I made this video. If I had to describe my experience in one word, I would be a pleasant surprise. I expected the game to just look good, but then I played it and it felt good, and I progressed through it, and that was probably the best part somehow. And to me, that's a greater victory than most video games. And yeah, there is no escape, the way that plays into the main thematic thrust of a lot of the narrative, because first there is no escape from hell, then you escape hell, then there is your father, there's no escape from your father, and after you get Persephone's back, you're trying to escape from the fate of the Olympians and trying to progress the story. It's all just big. Thank you for watching, and see you next time, because Jesus, this game is really, really, really good.